Good evening. My name is Thomas Gaehtgens, and as the director of the Getty Research Institute, it is my privilege to welcome you to tonight's lecture. The Getty Research Institute looks back onto a long history of collecting archives of galleries, art dealers, and art collectors, which makes it a fertile field for provenance research. The Getty Provenance Index was founded in the early 1980s and has grown to contain almost 2 million records taken from source material such as archival inventories, auction catalogues, and dealer stock books spanning periods from the late 16th century to around 1800. Since 2008, we have enlarged our research interests and invested in the Nazi-era provenance research. We initiated an international workshop on Nazi-era provenance research as a first step to bringing together the various scholars and initiatives inciting conversation and exploring common issues and questions. Over the last years, the GRI led an ambitious collaborative effort to locate, digitize, and add to the Provenance Index all extant German language auction catalogues dating from the Nazi era from 1933 to 1945, adding several 100,000 records entering the Provenance Index to facilitate research about looting during the Nazi period. However, this does not help a lot if a researcher tries to trace an important collection which has been confiscated by art dealers in the service of Hitler, Goering, and other Nazi leaders who, by persecuting especially Jewish collections, enriched their holdings. We have in our special collection several archives that are of high value to the study of the art market and the history of the overwhelming looting during that period. Among others, researchers can access, for example, the correspondence of Gustav Kramer, owner of the Kramer Oude Kunst Gallery in The Hague, who was heavily involved in Nazi art sales. Then the archive of German art expert and lawyer Wilhelm Arnz, the art historian and former museum director Alois Schardt, Otto Wittmann, the Felbermayr photos for the Allied Central Collecting Point in Munich, or the papers of Douglas Cooper, who did extensive research of Nazi art collections. And lastly, we have one of the best libraries in art history. At the same time, while we were engaged in research about the Nazi period, a very active and silent researcher was working in our library to explore what could be found about the extremely valuable and important collection of the German family Goodman. And that's the right pronunciation. Originally from Dresden, which founded and developed the Dresdner Bank into one of the most important German banks later located in Berlin with branches and collaborations all over Europe. I personally had no idea about the presence of this reader in our reading rooms. One day, a friend sent me the book, The Orpheus Clock, by the author Simon Goodman. I did not get the point right away that Goodman was Goodman. However, this became clear very fast when I started reading this fascinating book, a real page-turner. The book is an extremely moving historical document, brilliantly documented and written, which engages the reader to follow the history of this important and successful Jewish family from the 19th century through World War I, the 1920s, and the tragedy of the Nazi period and the Holocaust. The second part of the book, however, is just as astonishing. And we will hear about this more tonight. Because it introduces the reader into the difficulties, the chase, the disappointments, the frustrations, the unfairness, the injustices of the surviving members of the family to fight for the reconstitution of their outstanding and extremely valuable former collection, which has been scattered all over the world. These chapters are about the Goodman collection, but they are also about much more. They are about justice and the long, exhausted, agonizing fight to get justice. Simon Goodman grew up in London after the Second World War, where he studied, later also at Munich University. He has worked in the music business since the 60s, building a company that he would later sell when his world shifted to the restitution of his family's art collection. After his father's death in 1994, Simon and his brother discovered the family history that had kept secret from them, that the Goodmans were in fact Jewish and had been the Goodmans. The Goodmans had been prodigious art collectors and owned a vast and extraordinary art collection, including works by old masters, impressionists, fine porcelain, Louis XV's furniture, tapestries, Renaissance sculptures, and silver and gold objects, including the Orpheus Clock, the 16th century golden treasure after which his book is named. Simon's father had tried to recover these looted works, which had ended up in the collection of Hitler and Goering, or sold to dealers and collectors, with many ending up in museums. While Simon's father's attempts to recuperate his family's treasures had been largely unsuccessful, and in fact met with much hostility, it would galvanize his son's dedication to pursuing this restitution over the next decades. Since then, Simon has undertaken the immense task of investigating his family's history and legacy by tracking down their collection of approximately 400 objects. This has required extensive research, some of which was done at the Getty Research Institute, using our collections of dealer and gallery archives and our library. It has also at times required legal action, and the Goodman family has been instrumental in changing policies for Nazi-looted art restitution. Simon brought the first settled suit in a US court to recover art stolen during the war, a Degas landscape at the Art Institute of Chicago, and brought the first major restitution in the Netherlands in the post-war era. The Goodmans helped mobilize a conference involving 44 countries to adopt principles for resolving issues of Nazi confiscated art, and Simon has given testimony before the US Senate Judiciary Committee in favor of extending the statute of limitations concerning Holocaust-era looted art. Indeed, he has witnessed and encouraged the art world changing attitudes about restitution since starting his quest for the German collection's recovery. I could not stop reading this book up to the last chapters, where the author mentions the library of the GRI several times, where he visibly has been an extended reader. And at the very end, in the acknowledgements, he thanks all those at the Getty Research Institute. The next day, I went down into the library and asked some of the librarians, "Did you read the Orpheus Clock?" The answer was no. Do you know an author named Simon Goodman? Well, yes, I think we have this name in our list of readers, but he has not been seen for a while. But I got his mail address. I wrote him, we met for lunch and some other occasions, and here he is. He has to calm down his dog now. And here he is. Simon will talk about the saga of a family, in its glory, in its tragic fate. It is a story of the history of the 20th century, which should never be forgotten. Please join me in welcoming Simon Goodman.
Well, thank you all so much for being here tonight. Thomas, thank you very much for that moving introduction. It's an honor to be here. As you point out, I'm more than fond of the institute you manage, and all the wonderful staff here have been so instrumental in my research, without which I might never have been able to write the Orpheus Clock. Truly grateful to all of you, and happy for this occasion to tell a little bit of my story. It starts here with my dear father, Bernard Goodman, originally born Bernhard Guzman. He was a rather sad, withdrawn, enigmatic man. Here he is in his later years in Switzerland. He might have well taken his strange story to the grave with him. He died unexpectedly in '94. He actually drowned in Italy. Thank God his girlfriend, Eva, had the presence of mind to pack up all these old papers, dog-eared art catalogues, old documents dating back to the war and beyond, and ship them to me and my brother Nick here in LA. Full of old travel documents, every passport stamped before, during the war, after the war, every page used, he traveled incessantly. There were all sorts of extraordinary letters which we had to decipher. This one written by Rose Valland, who's actually a great heroine of the French resistance. After the war, she became one of the heads of the French restitution effort. She helped my father and his sister enormously. She's actually played by Kate Blanchett in the Monuments Men movie, Hollywood aside. There were valuable, vital documents like this, which actually prove that our grandfather, the grandfather we never knew, had bought a Renoir, Le Poirier, the pear tree, in 1928. And here you see my grandparents, my father's parents, Fritz and Louise. You might notice, let's see if I can get my little pointer here, by Man Ray, the portraits by Man Ray in Paris in the late 20s. This is how he paid his rent, doing the society photos. So here in the 20s, still a happy time. Fritz and Louise had both been born in Berlin to actually sort of competing German-Jewish banking dynasties. But after the First World War, premonition, presence of mind, I'm not sure what, they decided to move to peaceful Holland. Germany seemed a little dangerous. They settled here in this beautiful estate called Bosbeek, outside Haarlem, about 20 miles west of Amsterdam, and grew the family. 2 children, my father and his young sister, Lily. But as we all know, the peace after the First World War didn't last that long. By 1939, we were back at war, and by 1940, Holland had been invaded by the Germans, and my grandparents were trapped. They had a chance to leave, but they never thought it would come to this, and they were stuck. Amazingly, just a month after the Holland's surrender, let's get my laser pointer again, this man was one of the first callers at Bosbeek. His name is Walter Andreas Hoffa, one of the most important art dealers and looters during the Holocaust era. You can see him here trying to sell a painting to one of his top clients, Hermann Göring, who inexplicably has stuck his finger in this painting, but no accounting. Hoffa and his cohort, another profiteer called Alois Miedel, were the first to extort some artworks from my grandfather. They were able to obtain 6 of the most beautiful Renaissance and Baroque gold and silver pieces from the Goodman collection, which was particularly famous for the Renaissance silver, which even before the Kaiser had greatly admired and was actually apparently rather jealous of. He wondered why these Jews had such a better collection than he had. So, you know, we weren't always that popular in Germany. After Hoffa and Miedel came another art dealer and prolific looter called Karl Haverstock. He first secured about 10 of the best paintings from my grandfather with the promise that he would ultimately get a visa out of occupied Europe, to Italy, actually. I'll explain that in a minute, why Italy. After those paintings, Haverstock came back with a partner of his, Julius Böhler, a Nazi dealer from Munich, who very thoroughly started to do a complete inventory of the house. Oh, I'm so sorry. You can see here he's doing it room by room: Herrenzimmer, Speisezimmer, Schlafzimmer, the gentleman's room, one of the dining rooms, one of the bedrooms. This is the first major inventory. There would be another even more exhaustive inventory. So bit by bit, this lovely home was stripped. You can see here all the Ming vases, Qing dynasty vases, Louis XV's chairs, Persian rugs. All of this would go. By the middle of the war, the house had been stripped bare. Nothing but the white walls remained. While this is going on, my poor grandparents are desperately trying to obtain this visa one way or another to get out, to actually go to Italy where they'd be welcome. The reason being that my grandfather's eldest sister had married a very senior Italian politician who wasn't Jewish and was close to Mussolini. He's called Senator Orsini. And Orsini was also a relative of Count Ciano, who was the Italian foreign minister at the time. So the Italian government actually ordered the Italian ambassador in Berlin to inquire with the police department, actually. So this, you see, this letter, and probably in my father's box, is signed by Heinrich Himmler, no less, the Reichsführer of the SS, chief of German police. And he rather sort of blandly reassures the Italian ambassador, the Jew, Goodman, in his home, Heemstede by the Hague, will be left undisturbed as long as they remain in their home. They will be free from state police interference. Well, this is written in June 1942. Already at that point, my grandparents were really the only Jewish family for miles around because of this sort of semi-privileged position they found themselves in. All the other Jews in the nearby village and town had been moved to the ghetto in Amsterdam, and then from there Westerbork camp, and from Westerbork mostly to Auschwitz, I'm sad to say. Less than a year after this, in May 1943, 2 SS officers come banging at the door and order my grandparents to pack as much as they can. They're to leave from the night train from The Hague. They desperately hope this is their exit visa. They're going to make it finally to Italy. And sadly, they were deceived one more time. The train ends up here in Terezínstadt in Bohemia, now in the Czech Republic. My grandfather survives about 11 months of being tortured and interrogated and beaten. Finally, the last day of April 1944, he's, by various accounts, either beaten to death or actually garroted, I hate to say. A month or so later, his wife, my grandmother, is put on a transport to Auschwitz, where she's murdered the day she arrives. Here you see my father, suitably sullen, morose, angry. This is just after the war. He's flying around Europe, desperately trying to find whatever possibly remains of his family home, his parents' collection, the art, the things they'd collected that they loved. Here you see the house, one of the little salons. This painting, actually, it's hard to tell. It's a pastel by François Boucher. He does get that back, but sadly, the Dutch government forced him to pay them compensation for the privilege of turning it back over to the family. So that's another long simmering resentment we have that one day actually every year I make a claim for the money they forced us to turn over after the war. This little Venetian lady by Jean Barbeau is actually, Rose Valland helped my father recover this. And here you can't really tell, but this is a beautiful still life by the great French-Swiss 18th century painter Jean-Étienne Lyotard. Here you see it in its full glory. This wonderful tea service in disarray. Interestingly enough, many of you probably know this already. This painting is right here in the museum up on the second floor, I think. So this is one of the paintings my father did recover, and unfortunately had to sell it in the late 50s in Switzerland so he could pay all his lawyers. And my father didn't have a real job until about 1960. So for the first 15 years after the war, this is all he did. There's a very strange story behind this. This wasn't one of the paintings looted from Holland. This was looted from my grandfather's storage in Paris, where he was playing safe. He had paintings in New York, he had stuff in Switzerland, all over the place. Kind of a premonition. He knew things were going to go badly, but didn't realize they were going to go as badly as they did. So the Paris storage, of course, is discovered by the Germans after Paris falls, and this painting, all the paintings are taken. This one ends up in the hands of a very odd consortium of a couple of Paris dealers, one called Marteau and the biggest Berlin dealer auctioneer at the time called Lange. And between them, they decide they're going to sell this to Hitler. But what's very strange is these dealers were so greedy, they realized if they turned this into suddenly a pendant, a pair, they could make twice the money. So they find this, what is obviously a 19th century painting as opposed to the beautiful 18th century painting. They actually readjust the size somewhat so they exactly have the same dimensions, and then they sell this to the Linz Museum for Hitler's collection, and they pay a huge amount of money. What I find so odd about this, one is the chutzpah of these dealers, that they're cheating Hitler, no less. But also what's strange, in a more sort of morbid sense, is that though my grandfather's life obviously mattered naught to these people, his name on the provenance clearly impressed the top Nazis all the way up to the Führer himself. It's a little strange. All right, here's a good painting that my father did get back. We all thought this was by Hans Memling, but today it's apparently by Gérard David, but anyway, a beautiful sort of Flemish master. So this he did get back, but here are some. This Bosch, now in the National Gallery of Canada, has eluded him and my brother and myself to this day. It's a long, complicated story. Here, this Franz Hals, same story. This is now in the San Diego Museum of Art down in Balboa Park. The legal complications behind this painting are such that we haven't been able to make a valid claim yet. It's a long, complicated story, but I explain some of it in the book, which I hope you'll read. Here, this is an extraordinary document. In my father's boxes, there was this hastily written note by my grandfather, P for Papi, although it says Ritz Hotel, Paris. This is actually written in Holland during the occupation. It's smuggled out by a friendly Italian diplomat. And in this quick letter, my grandfather is alerting my aunt, who's already safely in Italy, about the Franz Hals and the Bosch in New York, along with the Weitstoss angels, which I'm actually claiming was the St. Louis Museum right now. And then he goes on about his Paris storage. He goes, there are most important pieces, including the Hans Baldwin Green, the Signorelli, one Renoir, two Degas, and many most important French items of furniture and other things. So here you see the first Degas. By the way, I'm sure there are a few very accomplished researchers in this room. This one is still missing. The last mention of it anywhere is 1942 in the ERR, looting archive that is now available. One of the things that you see today, I can search the ERR. This was the looting, the German looting organization that was particularly active in Paris and France during the occupation. Today, it's catalogued online. I can search it from my home. This is something my father couldn't possibly have done. I mean, most of the wartime documents were all sealed for 50 years after the war by the State Department, the British Foreign Office. West Germany followed suit, the French, the Dutch. So what my brother and I have been able to find is vastly different from what was available immediately after the war, where the secrecy, the veil, the cover-up was just blanketly complete. So anyway, this is one Degas that we're still looking for. Usually it's called Femme se chauffant. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a fireplace here where the lady's warming her hair while her maid combs her hair. Here's the other Degas. It's an unusual landscape, and this painting honestly changed my life. Here it is in full color, rather beautiful, unusual painting. And this was the first painting I ever found in 95, almost exactly a year after my father had died. And we discovered this, it was in Chicago, belonging to a very powerful, wealthy pharmaceutical billionaire who fought me and my brother tooth and nail for well over 3 years, if not 4. What we were up against, here's an example of a catalogue raisonné of the time. Notice that there are absolutely no dates here whatsoever, except to the present owner, 51. Well, fourth is Provenance, quatrième vente Degas, the fourth sale. This is from Degas' sort of studio. This actually is in 1919, although they don't say this, which was 2 years after Edgar Degas died. And then the first owner they mention is Hans Wendland, who actually turned out to be one of the greatest looters during the war. He's on the top of the red list compiled by the OSS, which was the precursor of the CIA. He was the top German Nazi dealer operating actually not out of Paris, but through Switzerland, where so many paintings were smuggled during the war and even after the war. So there's no mention of my grandfather anywhere. This is the kind of thing my brother and I were up against, that there was either this sort of woefully incomplete information or in some cases sort of downright misleading. Also, interestingly, they changed the name. The painting, according to Degas and our family, was just paysage, which means landscape simply. But somebody added this very American name here, smokestacks, I mean, maybe to throw my poor dad off the trail. So here you see this, my brother and I, Nick, and myself, making history. This is the restitution ceremony, I think about 98, in the Art Institute of Chicago. This was the first Nazi-looted painting in the US case to be settled. We actually settled out of court when it became apparent the trial would have been so expensive that theoretically just our family alone would have been expected to pay more than the value of the painting. But it was a great victory and hard fought, but well won. Here's the Renoir, which we were chasing at the same time. Actually, Nick went to the old Getty Villa, and a wonderful curator there, I forget his first name, Jaffe, an Englishman whose family had also been looted. He took him a few weeks, but then he suddenly remembered he'd seen this in an old Sotheby's Parc Bernay catalogue in New York in '69. From there, we traced it to this sort of unlovely storage facility in South London, just behind Waterloo Station, of all places. This painting had sort of been, well, not forgotten, but it was just an asset. It was actually quite damaged. And in reality, the paper, the deed to the painting had bounced from one private company in Liechtenstein to some security in Panama, then to some private bank in the British Virgin Islands. And unfortunately, because of the British Virgin Islands connection, particularly under English law where the painting was, the current owner had good title, so we were able to eke out a fairly decent settlement. It was quite a battle, but at least they acknowledged our family's original ownership and compensation was paid. Meanwhile, the family's Portrait of a Young Man by Botticelli, around the same time, appears at Sotheby's in New York. This time actually was my grandfather's name on the provenance, which was interesting. You know, at least they got the provenance right. We had about a year before, our lawyer, when we were first chasing the Renoir, had provided them with a list of, not all, but several of the artworks we were looking for. The Botticelli was on that list. So they knew exactly when they put this up for sale, but it didn't seem to hinder them or bother them particularly. And we weren't able to stop the sale, but we were able to freeze the funds. My brother flew to New York quickly to negotiate with the consignor, and he struck a very interesting deal. In sort of 5 minutes, the two lawyers were out of the room. So 1-to-1, just the Englishman and the Italian, he was an Italian consignor, a deal was struck. It wasn't, again, ideal, but it was an important settlement. And again, legally, we were on, shaky ground. So it was quite an achievement. Meanwhile, we were busy. We were fighting, not just two billionaires, three, a big auction house, but actually a foreign government. Back in Holland, we'd been lobbying the Dutch government. It had become apparent that the monuments men had recovered much of the artworks and furniture, antiques that were on those long inventories by the Nazi dealers, Böhler and Haverstock. The monuments officers did find a lot of it, but they weren't equipped to deal with individual claimants like somebody like my father. That was too messy. They didn't want thousands of people knocking on their door. They couldn't, it was would have been a bureaucratic nightmare. So they simply deduced which country something had been looted from, and they returned the artwork to that particular country, to the new government. So hundreds of our belongings went back to the new Dutch government after the war, where they quietly absorbed them into the Dutch National Collection. So it took us lobbying. There were, some very helpful people in the Dutch press who waged quite an effective campaign against the government, and we got help from the World Jewish Congress and all sorts of, sources. Eventually, in 2002, they decided to return to us about 240 40 pieces. And this was the first major restitution in Holland in about almost 50 years. So this is Mrs. Goodman takes her seat, finds her place. Here I am helping my old dear Aunt Lily onto this duchesse, kind of half a chaise longue that had belonged to her mother. And it was a very emotional moment. This was one of the paintings that came back. Jakob Elsner painted in Nuremberg, 1490. This went to Hitler's collection. Beautiful French antiques like these chenets, great tapestries. And here's very good example of some of the wonderful gold and silver. This is actually not Renaissance, but Baroque, technically. Was by a goldsmith called Johannes Lenker. My brother and I found this in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And here you see me and my lovely wife, May, with what was known as the Petzold cups. My family had acquired these from the Rothschilds in Frankfurt in the 19th century. These are Renaissance wedding cups, and this was part of the first forced sale through Hoffa and Miedel. These two cups, amongst other things, went to Field Marshal Goering. So here we are toasting our family's success. My brother and I, at this point, had been working ceaselessly for 7 to 8 years on this quest of ours. So we both had a nice holiday in Europe, but soon I was back at work. I found this interesting document. This is one of these documents that my father could never have touched after the war because these were all sealed as state secrets. This, I think, I found in the German Federal Archives in Koblenz on the Rhine. This is like a deposition by Karl Haverstock about what he did was the first 10 masterpieces he was able to extract from my poor grandfather. So the first 3, the Holbein, Memling, and Burgmeier, had been delivered to the Munich collection point. The next 4, this is the Jacob Elsner, Isenbrandt, Cranach, Van Goyen, had been sold to, where's he gone here, Dr. Possi, the head of the Linz Museum, so that's Hitler's collection. They were eventually found in the famous salt mines at Alt-Aussee in central northern Austria, and ultimately turned over as well. Number 8, 2 Renaissance shields are still missing. 10 Chinese carpet disappeared. This is what I was interested in, an oil from by von Stuck. This grabbed my attention because I'd never heard of anything like that. I wasn't even sure who von Stuck was at that point. Haverstock says here, I have sold this to Dr. Brandt of Berlin. Well, Dr. Brandt turned out to be not an ordinary doctor. Here he is with his lovely bride, Annie Brandt, who was sort of a Nazi pin-up. She'd won a bronze medal at the notorious Olympic Games, I think in '36 in Berlin. You see his 2 friends here at his wedding. Goering was just a few of his medals, and this guy, I'm sure you all know who he is. Brandt was not an ordinary doctor. He was actually the Führer's personal physician, and he, I hate to say it, was the person who instigated the medical experiments and also the euthanasia program. He was arrested by the British at the end of the war and turned over to the Americans, who hanged him. But back to the Stuck, Franz von Stuck, as it turns out, is the artist from Munich, a German, eccentric, late 19th century symbolist painter. Our missing painting turned out to be called Die Sünde, the sin. Well, to my horror, Franz von Stuck had painted about 24 paintings with the same title and exactly the same subject, this semi-naked lady with this lascivious snake wrapped around her. Well, where did I start? I kept on cutting these out and sending them to my poor, 90-year-old aunt in Italy, who said, I don't know what this was. She didn't remember, because all she remembered was that her mother hated the painting. I think my grandfather had bought it. He'd had a sort of little mental crisis. He was in Munich when the Wall Street crash happened. And I think he had to go out and buy something to calm his nerves. And he came home with this strange painting. Well, here's another thing that my father couldn't possibly have ever found. Today, the University of Augsburg has kindly put out a collection about this infamous Nazi looter, calling it, the controversial art dealer and collector. Well, controversial is a bit of an understatement. However, kindly in the back of this book, they have these very small photos with a number here linked to his inventory, which correlated to one of the forced sales with my grandfather. So I finally knew which lady and lascivious snake was ours. And then it wasn't that long before I traced it here. It's what it looks like today. I found this in a book. I think it could have been here too, a book called Femme Fatale. And the photographer kindly had mentioned that it was belonging today in a private collection in the Hollywood Hills. Well, I tracked him down. No, he didn't live that far from where I did. He was horrified when I explained the story. It turned out to be a Jewish collector. And it took about a year backwards and forth, but eventually he realized when I explained, who Dr. Brandt was and where the painting had been. It had even been hidden in Hitler's bunker for a while. And then he was particularly fixated on what had happened to my grandmother. He decided he didn't like the painting anymore, and he actually took it off his wall and helped load it in the back of my old Jag, and I drove down the hill elated. It was the sort of perfect restitution. And then I found this here, this very interesting catalogue. Masterworks from 4 centuries. This is 1938 in Rotterdam. Interestingly enough, this isn't a masterwork from any of these centuries. This is another fake, again, sold to Goering. As I say, the nerve of some of these dealers, but the profits to be made were enormous. This was sold to Goering as an original Vermeer. Today we know it was painted by a disgruntled Dutch painter at the time called Han van Meijeren, whose own paintings didn't sell. So he decided he was going to invent a long-lost period of the master Vermeer's catalogue, which he did quite successfully for a while. The wonder of this catalogue is, apart from this great fake, inside are some very genuine paintings. This one is one of the several canards that were in my grandfather's collection, and here's another painting that's still missing, by the way, so if any of you sleuths out there, text me, Facebook, please. This is a Saxon prince. He's called Johann Friedrich der Großmütige. I hope my German is good. It means John Frederick the Magnanimous, Prince of Saxony. Normally, Canard painted these men in rather drab fashion because these were the first Lutherans, but here he is in his finery, marrying Henry VIII's sister-in-law, Anne of Cleves' sister. So this is his wedding night. Long lost. Here, the catalogue raisonné, for once, actually is very accurate and still lists my grandfather, Fritz Goodman, as the last known owner. So that's one good thing. And here's the Baldwin Green mentioned in my grandfather's hastily written note. So now I knew what it looked like. And then, again, here at the Getty, I went through every book on Baldwin Green. Most didn't mention this painting. A couple did, but only before the war, which didn't really help me. And then I found one small volume by a German academic called Gert von der Osten, who was actually resident at Princeton at the time in the 50s. And he wrote in his notes that he'd gone to pay a visit to Rutgers University just over in New Brunswick. And they showed him, here it is, today, they showed him the Baldwin Green and asked his opinion, and so he wrote a note about this. So when I read this book, I took the next flight to Jersey and showed up at New Brunswick with a telephone directory's worth of documents proving that this had belonged to my family. Took about 2 years because Rutgers is a state university, but they eventually did the right thing as well, and it came back. Here's a lovely Guardi. So here you see that this is a genuine pair, 2 pendants. These disappeared in Switzerland during the war, but I was able to track them down to a private collector in England, and this is quite recent. Sotheby's this time round, who now have a fully funded well-staffed restitution department. Their vice president personally helped me negotiate the settlement on these. Here's one that I'm still in negotiation with. Christie's are helping me with this one. So, times have changed since my brother and I started on this quest. This we thought was a William van der Velde, beautiful seascape, van der Velde the younger, because there are a few Van der Veldes. But it's none of the Van der Veldes, it turns out. Today it's attributed to Jan van der Capelle, an equally important Dutch seascape painter from the Golden Age. But this is another thing that hampers me and probably people like me in my search, is that I have to cast a very wide net, because the attribution for these paintings seems to change every year. It's extraordinary. They keep changing their minds. So I can't just look for Van der Velde. I have to look for about, 6 similar Dutch painters from the same period who all did painted exactly the same thing almost. Anyway, so we're negotiating this finally. And all right, back to the Getty. And you mentioned the Gustav Kramer letters. Here he's talking, Goeppel, one of Goering and Hitler's agents, talking about artworks from Bosbeek, our home. This is 1943. So this is just after my grandparents have been arrested, so the house is now empty and they're busy mopping up, taking out what's left. This was pried out of the salon wall over the doorway. This is a long, complicated story. I'm still battling a museum in Northern Holland about this. More extraordinary is here, I found here in Brentwood, here at the Getty, in this Gustav Kramer file, files, beautifully archived, by the way. I mean, this is a fantastic resource. This is a handwritten letter by my grandfather, Fritz, F.B. Gutmann, Fritz Bernhard Gutmann. He's asking Mr. Kramer what happened to Haverstock, who promised him his visa to Italy. And rather prophetically, this is written the 10th of May, 43, so it's exactly 2 weeks before he's actually arrested and shipped to the concentration camp. And here you see the last comprehensive inventory of the house. This is just item 27, but some of these things are multiple pieces. So another 400 beautiful antiques, but these was considered the minor antiques. I think I've traced these through the Getty's wartime, a few, the engravings that are on this list through a Munich auction house called Karl und Faber. They resold these in 43. So it's one of the many loose ends that I haven't, sewn up yet. Meanwhile, still working on my grandfather's lost collection, I turn a few years ago to my great-grandfather, the originator of the gold and silver collection. It's Eugen Gutmann, or Eugene Gutmann. This is actually painted by his friend Max Liebermann, the great German Impressionist painter. This painting today is in the State Museum in Berlin. And this is where the family fortune was founded, as Mr. Gaehtgens mentioned, the Dresdner Bank. This is the original headquarters in Dresden, but shortly, 10 years or so before they moved the headquarters to Berlin. You see here the headquarters in Berlin in the middle 30s, sadly under new management. So all the directors, all the Jewish directors, including several from my family, were all kicked out a long time ago. However, this is interesting. Here we have, this is the art collection, Kunstsammlung Eugen Gutmann, 1912 catalogue. I have to say, this is the one book that I was not able to find in the Getty Research Institute. There are only about 100 or so made. There's one at Oxford University, one at the Louvre, one at the Rijksmuseum. Christie's and Sotheby's both have one. And fortunately, Heidelberg University has one, and they've recently digitized it. So it's one of the many modern aspects of my search that are facilitated by the incredible technology today. I had to buy this before Heidelberg digitized it, at great expense. But apart from the wonderful photos inside, even more extraordinary was this letter I discovered, signed by Julius Böhler, no less, one of the looters of my family's home. And here he's writing to Baron von Hummel, who is Hitler's chief of staff, saying, Mr. Haverstock from Berlin asked me to send this to you with the enclosed catalogue of Eugen Gutmann's collection, Heil Hitler, Julius Böhler. So the implication was, if there's anything in here, what would the Führer like? It was full of extraordinary things. When we call it the silver collection, but it wasn't all silver. There were beautiful sort of encrusted, jeweled little boxes. This one by Neuber, Christian Neuber from Dresden as well, actually. This is more typical, one of these exotic nautilus shells fashioned by a great goldsmith in Antwerp in 1600. Beautiful bronzes, this one by Adrian de Vries. Here we go, this is called the Jamnitzer Becher. Goering particularly had set his sights on this one. You see the gold ivory tower and a complete little Gothic town made out of coral sticking out of the top. And here I discovered this in the American archives at the Ardelia Hall collection in Maryland. This is what was turned back over to the American Army in the Munich collecting point. And this is the Americans checking off what has come back. And interestingly, number 103 and 106 are missing. And this caught my attention. This simply means round table clock out of gold and bronze, South German, second half of the 16th century. And this one, equally prosaic, the description, square table clock. Equally gold, bronze, South German, second half, 16th century. Well, this is the round table clock, not any old round table clock. And I deduced, this is actually the frieze round the side. This is Orpheus playing his lyre. This is Eurydice trying to escape from Hades. And from this I deduced it's an Orpheus clock, because I'd read somewhere there were actually about 10 to a dozen made in Nuremberg during the Renaissance, mostly for the Holy Roman Emperor who lived in the castle there at the time. And talking of castles, I was actually able to trace this, because it's an extremely rare clock, to this castle, which is the old castle in the middle of Stuttgart. So this is today the Landesmuseum of the state of Baden-Württemberg. I was very fortunate. They had a curator there who was also one of the great provenance researchers in Germany, and it didn't take me that long to convince her that this wonderful piece belonged to my family, and she agreed, and we petitioned the state of Baden-Württemberg, and after, again, a year or so, here's the extraordinary dial, also by Jamnitzer. So very odd, it's a 6-hour clock, and there's just one hand, this sort of undulating serpent, very beautiful. Oh, and here's the square table clock. Actually, it has 9 dials. This is by another master clockmaker called Johann Reinhold. These two pieces, ironically, my brother and I have received restitutions here in the United States, France, Holland, Britain. This was the first direct restitution to my family from Germany, so it's a big deal. I was very proud. It was extremely hard work, but it was a wonderful moment. They also actually they were terrified I was going to get this back off them too, but this is wonderful. This is an automaton. The ostrich flaps his wings on the hour, and the little monkey beats his drum. He says that's where you wind it up. It still works. My father had sold this quite legitimately in New York in the late 50s with his cousins, so this, just by coincidence, ended up in the same museum. And here you see me not far away. I was, ever eager to, take every opportunity, every museum I'll visit just in case. Here I am in the basement of the German National Museum, in the basement here at Nuremberg. I thought for a minute I'd found our missing Tetzel cat, one of the many silver gold pieces from our Renaissance collection, but it turned out, I was very disappointed, it's a Victorian copy. And the museum says they don't know where the original is either. But we're still looking. And so I'm still, even despite all these successes in the last 20 years, my brother and I are still looking for probably, a dozen good paintings, another 20 important silver gilt pieces, and countless antiques, so maybe my son or one of my brother's daughters will pick up the search eventually, but for the moment, this is where I leave off. The Orpheus Clock is where I end the story. It seemed to symbolize, the travails that my family have been through over the generations, and how, compared to where we've been today, is a happy time where the world seems to mostly be awakening to the terrors and injustices that happened during that period, and how today, at least, a modicum of justice is available. So I was very proud to put down on paper our family history and what we've been through, and I hope you get a chance to read it and enjoy it, and although some of it's quite depressing, of course. I'm happy to take a few questions if we have time. Okay.
Let's have some questions. There are microphones on the left side and on the right side.
Would you say that there are works that are harder to research than others? Like, it seems like landscapes, they could... Do you want to comment about that? Works that are, depending on the genre, that are harder or easier to trace? It seems like landscape would be high on the list of difficult ones.
Well, that's true, yes. A specific portrait is usually much easier to trace than, say, Van Goyen painting a little tree leaning over a stream somewhere, because Van Goyen painted the same tree 20 times, and so did his friend Van Riesdael and many other, followers, pupils. So those are very hard to track down until you find the specific photo of what was like. When I find a catalogue of something my family lent to an exhibition before the war, that's proof that's our painting. But I focus on what's doable. So what is, I'm pragmatic, what's the easiest, honestly, and what's the easiest to prove. So, the really complicated ones get pushed back to the end of the line because there's so much I still have to hunt for. I go for what's easily identifiable today, and also I focus on North America and Western Europe. Forget South America, because nothing's coming out of there. Forget Russia. I know my father's godfather, all his half his Rembrandt drawings are still in Russia, but it's impossible to get back. So I focus on what's doable. I'm a pragmatist,
Yes, in the middle there. Yeah.
Would you detail a bit the problems that you have in either reclaiming or getting restitutions from museums?
Well, it all depends on which museum. As I said, the Zimmerli Museum that belonged to Rutgers University turned out to be an exemplary museum that followed the Washington principles to the T and did what they should have done and did the right thing. Especially as the painting had been donated to them in the first place. It's not like they had to shell out any money. But today I have a battle I mentioned briefly with the St. Louis Museum for two German Renaissance sculptures. They're not being so easy. Then, of course, there's the issue right here in Pasadena. Family friends of ours, the Hautsticker heirs, have been battling for their two Cranachs for years now. And It's cost them an absolute fortune, and it's still not clear how that's going to end up. So every museum is different. You know, some museums seem to do the right thing. The museum in Houston, for instance, ended up with the Jaffe family. You know, they're good and bad. I mean, you know, because there are no laws about this. They sign on. They pay lip service to the Washington Principles and the Terezin Convention, but in practice, when it comes to their own collection, not all of them are that, you know, eager to give up, you know, even if it's something that's in storage. But
Yeah,
yes.
that's another question.
How many institutions have returned your art without a hassle?
Well, there's almost never no hassle. There's little hassle and great hassle. So the collector here in LA, you know, he was probably, because he was a human. I find when it's one-on-one, and I can say, I'm the heir, I'm the family, I'm what's left of the family, I get through to them on a human level. You know, when sometimes we've had to hire high-powered lawyers, then, of course, the other side will hire high-powered lawyers too, and then it gets very complicated and very expensive.
Did your grandfather have an inventory number on the pieces, or was there anything which could help to identify these?
Well, after the war, my father and his wife, his sister, did from memory a fairly good inventory. Then so did the family lawyer. Then we kept on finding catalogues where we lent things. So over the years, we've been able to piece together a pretty accurate inventory of what was in the collection. There are records of somebody in my family buying a particular painting, but no, my great-grandfather's collection is thoroughly inventoried in 1912, and there was even a previous inventory in 1906. My grandfather's collection is not thoroughly inventoried until the Nazis take over. So that's one of the, I don't want to say I want to thank them for something, but they did leave great paperwork. So it wasn't until we were able to find the Nazi inventories of the house in US archives, German archives, Dutch archives, etc., that we were able to really identify everything. Since then, I found an inventory of what he'd put into storage in Paris as well, but so today it's far more scientific than when my poor dad was just doing it from memory.
The books that have been returned, have they ever been displayed or public viewing, or is there any opportunity to see?
Well, most of the pieces we get back, I have to admit, you know, we can't hang on to. They're extremely expensive. My brother and I have to share them with our aunt's family, their cousins, and we have our expenses. Just as my father didn't have a real job for 15 years, this is what I do and what I've been doing for 20 years. So I have expenses too. We've hired all sorts of lawyers and researchers. They all need to be paid. So invariably, we have to sell most and divide it fairly. It's the only way to divide a painting is to monetize it, unfortunately. We do keep as much as we can, usually minor things more of sentimental value than of great value. So my home, my brother's home, we have all sorts of artifacts. I even have in my bedroom at home my grandfather's shaving stand that Julius Burler used, I discovered from one of his inventories, as a flower pot holder. So it's not terribly valuable, but it's of great sentimental value to me. Yeah, whereas, you know, the Botticelli, until very recently, was in the Art Museum of Denver. You know, most of these paintings, the Degas that we found is back in the Art Institute of Chicago, and so on. The Lenker Ewer is back in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, only they paid for it this time, and so on.
Another question? Yeah.
Is there one item that you're looking for that would be the home run, the best thing that you have? Is there one specific?
Well, my personal taste is for a very 1400s Cassone panel that's now identified by a Florentine painter called Biagio d'Antonio. So it's a battle scene. It's painted on wood. It's about 4 or 5 feet long, and there's another Biagio d'Antonio that's similar in the National Gallery in Washington. There's one in the Great Museum in Stockholm. They're quite rare. It's something that I would love. It also happens to be, I think, one of the first important paintings my grandfather bought. As soon as he'd bought the house in Holland, he started roaming Europe and all the art galleries, and he bought that in Paris, actually, from an Italian count. And it's missing. I have a clue as to where it's gone, but yes, I would love to get my hands on it, and if I could afford it, I'd have to pay my brother off, of course. I'd like to keep it, but we'll see about that. First things first. And of course, the missing Degas, the missing Canard, there's so many great pieces. I'd be happy with any of them.
There's another one.
Wondering how your father survived the war and then the effort that he made.
Yeah.
Did he have any successes in recovering?
Well, he had a few. I didn't have a chance to mention that my father had been at Cambridge University in England, and when he graduated, interestingly enough, his father told him not to come back, which is kind of odd. So his father my grandfather knew enough to say, it's dangerous, stay where you are. And yet he himself stayed in Holland, which had been neutral. But anyway, so my father joined the British Army as soon as war was declared. He was nearly killed. He was hit by a German bomb. He was in plaster cast for about 6 months, but he did survive. And as soon as he could, he was probably the first civilian back in Holland. He went to visit the old home, which to his horror was full of about 200 Nazi children, because all their parents had just been arrested at the end of the war as collaborators, so they were sort of temporary orphans. And the Dutch government said, oh, well, these Jews have gone. This is a convenient house. Let's fill it full of these, awful children. So that's what he confronted. He did, as I said, he got back the Memling, he got back the Lyotard, he found quite a few things. But in many cases, the Dutch government, when it was the Dutch government and not the French government, the Dutch government insisted he compensate the Dutch state. He had to pay them the value that was supposedly paid my grandfather during the occupation, money that was put into a frozen bank account and eventually converted into German war bonds. Of course, the Jews weren't allowed to touch their bank accounts anymore. So we never saw the money, but on paper, there had been a transaction. So these Nazi dealers at the end of the war said, oh, I bought that quite legitimately. That was the reasoning behind the Dutch's position on that. So my father did have some success, but that all dried up by about 1960. After that, he kept trying. When Germany reunited, East and West became one country again, the letters started flying one more time. He thought, now there's a chance, because he'd always been told by the West Germans, oh, we don't have that, it must have gone east, which was a polite way of saying go to hell, really. But so he tried hard.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, there's a last question? Yeah.
This book it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And to me, what was equally compelling was not just the search for the art, but how you wonderfully categorize the diabolical and methodical manner in which the Germans treated the Jews and how they persecuted them. And I'm just wondering how this whole search for you changed you personally.
Well, it's been a very painful search, but I'm a sort of bit of an English bulldog spirit. Once something's between my teeth, I have to get to the bottom of it. So, I visited the concentration camps. I bought every memoir written by survivors of Theresienstadt, even some that were salted away in the rafters that had been, found by posthumously, the authors had been murdered, but their diaries had been hidden in the woodwork. So I read every one methodically so I could piece together what had happened to my grandparents exactly. I'm very proud of that central part of the book where I even find the train numbers, the cell number my grandfather's locked into, and all of that. I have the name of the capo. So for all the Holocaust deniers out there, this is exactly what happened to one couple, you know, down to the T. And it's painful, but yes, I had to. This is, you see, nobody told me and my brother, this is our grandparents had somehow died during the war. That's about as much as we knew, as we'd ever been told. It was too painful for that generation. My father and his sister's generation, they couldn't talk to us about it. So we had to find out for ourselves. So I had to dig deep. You know, yeah, it's painful, but it's worth it.
Okay, thank you very much.